Welcome to history class today. I hope everybody's doing well at home, and we're going to be doing distance learning for a little while. So I'm going to be reading with you in lesson 67. We are actually on page 162. We're going to be getting back into China after our little break we've had for about a week or so. And let's start talking about the achievements of the Han. So while we're talking and reading about this today, let's be sure to think about our focus questions. Our focus questions are up in the blue. What were some of the achievements of the Han Dynasty? And what did the Chinese keep written records on before the invention of paper? So where we're at in history, paper has not even been invented. That's something to think about as we read. I'll start reading with you. If you're following along, you can get your book out and feel free to read along as I read. Or you can just listen. The era of the Han was a glorious period in Chinese history. The Chinese made achievements in medicine, manufacturing, science, and literature. The Han used special herbs as medicine, and they also developed the use of acupuncture. This procedure is done by poking needles through the skin at specific points on the body, and the purpose is to relieve pain or cure sickness. And some people today still use acupuncture. You know, I personally have never used acupuncture, but I know that a lot of people do use it today, which it's a pretty old procedure. Manufacturing. China also advanced in manufacturing. This increased the country's production of goods, and the Chinese had become master metalworkers. The iron plow and the wheelbarrow increased production on farms. Swords and armor made the army more powerful. So one way that the army was more powerful is they had a lot of swords and armor because they were master metalworkers. That's something to think about. If you're a master metalworker, what are you going to do with that mastery of metalwork? Well, you're going to use it to make weapons for yourself and make a better army. The Chinese began using the rudder, a vertical blade attached to a ship, and the rudder could be turned to change the ship's direction. Ships traveled farther, allowing China to establish trade connections with other countries. For centuries, the Chinese had known the productions for making silk. The Chinese raised silkworms and unwound the threads from the worms' cocoons. The threads were dyed and woven into beautiful fabrics. The Chinese kept these procedures secret, revealing the secret was punishable by death. During the Han Dynasty, weavers used foot-powered looms to weave the silk threads into fabric, and clothing made from silk was very expensive. It was originally reserved for the emperor and other important leaders. So let's go ahead and talk about some of these things that we've read. So has anybody ever seen a cocoon? You could think about the cocoon or a spider's web. That's something that they were using to make silk. They were raising silkworms and the cocoons, and it's such a fine fabric that they were really, it's so fine it's hard to explain. But when you think about a spider's web, that's what they were weaving together. They were such fine threads. And silk is actually one of the finest cloths in the world. That's one of the reasons that it's very expensive when you get real silk, real Chinese silk. So let's go ahead and go to the next page in your textbook. About science. A man named Chang Hing invented an important scientific instrument called the seismoscope. It was used to detect earthquakes, and the Chinese called it an earthquake weather clock. Chinese seismoscopes were bronze jars decorated on the outside with 8 dragon heads. Each dragon held a small ball in its mouth and pointed in one of 8 different directions. And under each dragon sat an open-mouthed frog. And you can see a picture of it right here. Inside the bronze jar was a pendulum. Whenever the earth moved, the pendulum would move, causing one of the balls to drop from the dragon's mouth into the frog's mouth, and the Chinese determined the direction of the earthquake by which frog the ball fell in. Earthquakes cause damage to buildings and land, and after an earthquake struck, the Chinese leaders used the seismoscope to determine the earthquake's location. And then the leaders sent troops out to that area. And the troops carried food and supplies to help people, particularly the farmers, whose work supported the entire country. Let's talk about literature. During the Han Dynasty, poets created long works of literature that combined poetry and prose. Another poetry style featured short lines of verse that could be sung. Poets were hired for the beauty of their verses. Han writers also created important works of history. Sima Qian wrote a complete history of all the Chinese dynasties. Through the early Han, his writings were important, especially since Qin Shi Huang Ti had destroyed many works during the Qin dynasty. Sima Qian's works were called the Shijia, records of the grand historian, and his style and format became the model for the later historical writings. So let's talk about the things that were discussed in science and literature. We learned about a seismoscope. Seismoscopes are still used today. And because they were invented in ancient China, how do you think they've improved since then? Do you think the disaster responses are probably the same or different? Do people go to where earthquakes have happened? Do they wait a couple days? Do they go straight to farmers? Do they go to cities? What do you think happens? Have you had any experience with that? That's something to think about while we're reading. Let's go ahead and let's flip over to page 164 if you're following along in your book, or if you're just following along with the video, that's where I will be. We're going to be talking about paper. I think we all use paper a lot. Right now, we're probably not using as much paper because we're not in school. How many times a day do you use paper? Paper has become a part of everyday life. Newspapers, textbooks, labels, and money are just a few things that are made from paper. People did not always have paper to write on. That is crazy, don't you think? Before paper was invented, the ancient Chinese used silk, bone, turtle shell. I know that a lot of you are probably screaming right now, but yes, the ancient Chinese killed turtles and other materials to keep written records. The Chinese invented paper during the Han Dynasty, and they took hemp or plant fiber or tree bark and pounded it to a pulp. The pulp was mixed with water, and then the mixture was spread into a thin layer. The dried pulp formed a coarse sheet of paper. So unlike today's paper, this early paper was actually really difficult to write on. And the paper had other uses. It was used as wrapping for clothing or other items. So maybe it was used as also like a wrapping paper. It was also used in making lightweight armor, which is interesting. Arrows could not penetrate through the armor's many layers of paper. So if you can picture a person going to war but wearing a ton of paper, that's something that took place. Chinese paper makers later used fibers from rags, rope, or fishing nets to make a smoother pulp. And the Chinese continued to use paper for writing and eventually for making money. And this page you are reading is an echo of the ancient Chinese invention of paper. So, not the page you're reading because you're listening to a video, but if you're following along in your textbook, you are reading something that the ancient Chinese invented, which is great. So for your assignment, I want you to answer the focus questions that we talked about when we first started this video right here. What were some of the achievements of the Han dynasties? You should be able to come up with at least two really easily. You could probably come up with three if you tried. And I want you to answer number 2. You can answer them as a comment on this video, or you can have your parents email me or text me your answers, whatever's easier for you. All right, so I hope you guys are having a great day, and this is your Thursday History 6th grade video.